I want to welcome you all to the On the Brink Book Award Symposium, the first of two. This year, the jury awarded 4 prizes, and we are celebrating here our first 2 award winners, Rosetta S. Elkin, and Whitney Martinko, for their books and their incredible research that went into those books. And we're really grateful to have them both here. The On the Brink Award is named after J.B. Jackson and takes into account his scholarship, particularly in the sense of being interested in scholarship, which is approachable, which is valuable to academic pursuits, and which has an interest in exploring something that J.B. Jackson might have referred to as vernaculars, but we perhaps opened up that definition slightly into all kinds of human, quotidian, and as well as, sort of more academic pursuits that have to do with the built environment, broadly interpreted. We're very excited to have Whitney and Rosetta here this afternoon. I wanted to do a brief introduction about the books. From her publisher, Plant Life reveals that planting a tree can either be one of the ultimate offerings to thriving on this planet or one of the most extreme perversions of human agency over it. Plant Life exposes the relationship between human and plant life, revealing that afforestation is not an ecological act. Rather, it is deliberately political and distressingly social. We're going to have a chance to talk more after, but I just wanted to highlight Elkin's work is not only field work and writing, but also exhibits at the Victoria and Albert Museum and Les Jardins des Métiers, Chelsea Festival, and the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, and multiple writings. And as some of you know who were here last night, she is currently the director of landscape architecture at Pratt, and has been an associate professor of landscape architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she co-directed the Master of Design Studies in Risk and Resilience, which I think is relevant and pertains. She's also taught at Academy Bouwkunst and the Gerrit Rietveld Academy in the Netherlands, as well as having been employed by OMA and other related. She has a PhD from the Netherlands, University of Antwerp, thank you. And that rigor shows in the academic nature and the passion and excitement of her book. Whitney Martinko, from her publisher, Historic Real Estate, shows how Americans in the fledgling United States pointed to evidence of the past and the world around them and debated whether and how to preserve historic structures as permanent features of the new nation's landscapes. From indigenous mounds in the Ohio Valley to Independence Hall in Philadelphia, from Benjamin Franklin's childhood home in Boston to St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, Dutch colonial manors of the Hudson Valley to Henry Clay's Kentucky estate, early advocates of preservation strove not only to place boundaries on competitive real estate markets, but also to determine what should not be for sale, how consumers should behave, and how certain types of labor should be valued. Ultimately, Martinko argues by portraying the problems of the real estate market as social rather than solely economic, advocates of preservation affirmed a capitalist system of land development by promising to make it moral. This is Martinko's first book, and she tells this story to consider why the residents of the early United States regularly turned to corporate ownership of objects of collective significance and what effects incorporation had on the valuation of these permanent collections. She's interested in material histories, and although as a history professor, she's often inside the classroom and inside academia, she is also a public historian. So you'll find her work outside the classroom. And she generously came and talked about her podcast experience with my theory class today, because we ourselves are embarking on a podcast project. So that was a really lovely segue and offering for thinking about what public history means and what engaging in academic pursuits in the public can be construed as. Without further ado, and I hope I didn't take up too much time, I would like to welcome Rosetta Elkin to speak, to start with our condensed but hopefully intense version of thinking about plant life. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. This is my computer, right? Okay. They look the same. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the jury and University of New Mexico, just broadly for recognition. It's funny when you write a book, I don't know, maybe my colleague can attest, but it just kind of goes out there and then it's silent for quite a while. And that's very unlike design and practice and other pursuits that have a lot of feedback loops. And so it's a slower, just a slower trickle to recognition, which can be anticlimactic, but becomes very exciting because, of course, it takes time to read books. You can't expect people to read them right away. So I'm thrilled. I'm also thrilled to talk about slow time because that's plant time. It's also, to paraphrase J.B. Jackson, who the award is named after, of course, still has the greatest, I guess, in my opinion, the greatest definition of landscape, which is the speeding up or slowing down of time. And I wish sometimes that landscape architecture could take that to heart. In any case, that's some of the motivation for writing plant life, so that plants can become a little bit more than a spec, which they tend to be in design fields since they're living organisms, they're not concrete, but they do end up in the spec world in what we do as designers. So the book is an attempt to take that a little further into some more radical scales to express what happens when we do so. At the invitation of Catherine, I'm going to read a few passages and show some images and do an overview, and I hope that kind of gets gets the heart of it, but I look forward to the conversation and the overlap between our books. This book, Plant Life, is neither comprehensive of the plants of afforestation nor comprehensive of the projects of afforestation. Rather, I explore how the complicated ties and relations made in the human world, namely between constructing a scientific truth, generating a resource, and misleading public understanding, are physically manifest in the landscape. I'm interested in how design itself is reliant on linear scale and replication of technique, which leads me back to the experiences that instigated this research. Standing adjacent to a project of afforestation, the eye is led across the grid in such a way that it feels entirely designed. The landscape is made rigid, predictable, and static. And that is because afforestation is the deliberate planting of trees in otherwise treeless environments. That is not reforestation, which brings trees back into relations with a very humid, temperate environment that supports woody plants. The trees of afforestation are relatively powerless as a result and extremely dependent on the planter, if you will, although the planter usually walks away. So what I'm interested in is a practice that is less reliant on scalability. Copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste is not a great environmental mantra. Less reliant on scalability and unit-based valuation, instead paying close attention to the landscape as a living organism, because the land is alive with millions of unnamed species and unknown relationships that surpass the human imagination. This is not to say that we should not organize planting projects, plant trees, advance conservation, or plant in drylands. It is the means and methods of our plans that require our attentive notice now more than ever. So once a plant has become a unit, it is much easier to count. Once it is objectified like this, afforestation has a runway to scale, to achieving scale, to a kind of linearity of geometry that can be superimposed anytime, anywhere. And so I asked myself a very simple question when I started this research, which took some time, well over 10 years, if I'm honest. why are we planting trees in otherwise treeless environments? It's a very simple question. And that brought me, of course, to an answer that was much more complex than I had anticipated. The politics of plant life, which is how I think of it now, is located in the discrepancy between planting trees and removing trees, because accurate tallies do not exist for global tree loss. Destruction carefully avoids precision, while tree planting poses no statistical or analytical ambiguity. It is simply easier to count tree units than to explain the quantity of destruction in a complex forest biome. Deforestation statistics only emerge from acreage and area and find uncertain boundaries in logging claims and forest cover indicators in the margins of conservation reports. Deforestation creates what I call slippery facts. On the other hand, afforestation endures as planting individual units disseminates calculation and facts garner funds. Facts circulate headlines. Facts cannot be disputed, but facts without context are very risky things. This is today's paper. I met it at breakfast. It says February 20th at the top. Threats push Amazon closer to tipping point, study finds. Now, there are no statistics in this article. You can look it up in the New York Times. It's, of course, also in a lot of other sources. And so this kind of destruction that you see in this image is uncountable. It doesn't fit on a spreadsheet, and so it slips away. And that's what I mean by slippery facts, but we cannot counter deforestation with afforestation. Oops, I just pressed, see, I keep pressing your arrow. It's like, whereas a statistic like this, Ethiopia plants more than 350 million trees in 12 hours. Wow. Wow. That's something that people can get behind. That's something the state can get behind. That's something global mandates can get behind. That's something the UNCCD wants to celebrate. But nobody is asking the very simple questions that any designer, any gardener, any environmentalist would ask. Who is planting the trees? How many survive? What species are being planted? Where? And whose water supply are they drawing from? Or how are they getting watered? Just very simple questions you would ask of your street tree, your backyard, your neighbor, or a gift. And so this is not a gift. It is actually a political scheme to advance otherwise alternative agendas to tree planting itself. So I split the book into 3 parts, 3 chapters that in sort of, narrate might be the right word. I guess a little more academic than that, but narrate how we got there. How do we get to treating the plant as a tool and as an object, as a statistic, as a spec? And I broke it down, in a way, in terms of the way I started to think about it, which is that first the plant has to become an artifact of botany. It has to go through this scientific flattening, entirely made up of parts, so that it can then be listed. So we basically have to take the aliveness out of the plant organism, make it an object, signify it as such, and then it can get a Latin binomial. Once it has a Latin binomial, it can have a kind of shortened version of its like preferred habitats and things like that, and then get slapped on a list. We're all familiar with plant lists. The plant is already kind of totally disintegrated by the time it's on a list, but it's taken very seriously by the public because there's experts behind the list, there's scientists behind the botany, and so you get the list and you don't ask like, well, what's not on the list? Even though there's so much not on the list, often very specifically. And then of course the list or these specs make their way into the real world where people live. And that's what I call trace. So first plant as artifact, then plant as index, then plant as trace. So the first procedure, artifact, is a framework that sheds light on how the study of plants generally condenses aliveness. The word artifact, an object made by a human being, suggests that humankind considers plants a static product rather than a living organism. Artifact is a term that encompasses how plant life is forced awkwardly into human worlds and aggressively into biotic ones. Specifically, the creation of a predictable artifact engendered specialization of select plant parts, the berries, seeds, bark, or tonic, that create resources. The second procedure reveals the advance of tree units. Index is a word I use to register the economy of trade and accumulation, tallied by the mechanics of lists and manuals. The word index, to point out and make known, suggests a method of both identification and standardization. The formula of trading in units engages the familiar protocols of designers, and in that I conceive of afforestation as a kind of horticulture, the largest horticulture projects the world has ever seen, the practice of plant cultivation and management related to gardening. I include the forestry professional as a designer because their work is inherently biophysical, a feature of continental horticulture. The aggregate effect describes how the value of plant life is arrested as an object in artifact and then a unit of profit in index. One practice exploits the plant itself, the other knowledge of the plant. Oh, I did forget. Trace is the third procedure, marking the transition from abstraction, these kind of lists, to the material physical landscape. The word trace, to give an outline of, suggests how tree planting materializes as a means to gain jurisdiction over territory, setting up a response to crisis that appears real and very necessary. Spatially, the question lies in the disparity between forest plantations and extant drylands. What Trace reveals is that the brutality of afforestation is found in the failure to create lasting relationships. This is the difference between planting trees and growing trees. We don't count growing trees. We count planting trees because they are units. And so in each case, I also take a project and a plant to describe those procedures. In the African case, which I start with in the book, it's actually not chronological. The case in Africa, which is actually the case that's called the Great Green Wall. The case in China, just not to conflate that, the case in China is called the Free North Shelter Belt Project. Africa calls its project the Great Green Wall. Africa represents this African project, this Pan-African agency, represents the most current case of afforestation, which is primarily at this point a lot of plans and pilot projects. So this isn't a historic procedure I'm talking about. This is happening now. Then I move on to the American case, which is essentially the historic project, and then China, which is the largest and most ongoing. So it's been ongoing for about 70 years. And this is a typical pilot project in the African Sahel. What you will notice is that eucalyptus trees planted as a plantation. This is not called a plantation, this is called afforestation in the terms of the UNCCD. Obviously needs the same tools of horticulture that we need anywhere, which is drip line, planting holes, inoculates, injections, and pumping groundwater to the surface. If that isn't enough, they're doing so and you are also familiar with this, in an arid part of the world that is presumed to be empty, right? Because it doesn't have trees. There's plenty of life in drylands, and we all know that and can feel that here in a really intimate way, which I'm so happy to experience for the first time in New Mexico. When I talk to people in the Northeast where I live and work, it can be very different. But what I find remarkable about this kind of photograph that's put out there, as a propaganda, I suppose, is that nobody notices the extant trees, the trees that are already living there. And so the tree in the background is Fade herbia. Fade herbia is a single species in a genus, and they had conflated it with acacia, but it's not. It's its own species. They understand now. And Faidherbia is not on the list. It's just another way to put it. Faidherbia is not on the list because it does not take well to this kind of procedure. It doesn't want to be grown in nurseries. It doesn't like plastic pots. It doesn't want the inoculates. It will grow wherever it pleases. Thank you. But it is extremely well adapted to the desert, to the dry land, to very, very deep water tables. And it has this very unique reverse deciduous cycle, which is a very long-term evolutionary adaptation, thanks to its very close relationship with mycorrhizal fungi in the soils. So you can see Faidherbia here and how it's never planted in rows. It grows where it wants, but it is perfectly adapted for what one would consider the project. Here is the project from Jakar to Djibouti. Again, these afforestation projects are supracontinental. These are not small plans. But if anyone can really call this ecology or environmentalism, when you can understand the pumps and the infrastructure and just the drip line. Are we going to drip line that? I mean, it starts to become like really basic in a lot of ways. Like it's not even scholarly. It's just very basic questions that need to be asked of our so-called environmental politics, right? And much of the rationale for the African project is rooted in French colonialism and the invention of the word desertification, which was invented in 1949. It is not an ecological term. The ecological term is drought. There is no such thing as a desertification. And that was a rabbit hole of research, I'll tell you, but it was super gratifying because there was gold at the end of the rainbow. There was this first publication in 1949 by a French forester, André Aubreville, and that's in the African case. I encourage you to read it if you're interested in the term. The appropriation of desertification is simply one example of the purposeful application of ecological principles to highlight apparent environmental disorders. So-called technical terminology relies on intentional vagueness and results in overuse and maladaptive outcomes exemplified by afforestation. And terms simply propagate more terms. Desertification can be countered with another contemporary label we all often overuse, like greening. Global excitement and fervor for planting trees even replaces planting trees in Africa with planting trees for Africa. Entirely disregarding context from the rhetoric. As long as trees are being planted, location is subordinate to statistics. The Great Green Wall is set apart from other cases because jurisdiction is uniquely global. Funding sources range from the World Bank to Google, raising questions of value along with questions of scale. The next project in the next chapter is the Prairie States Forestry Project in the United States. Right here, it is the emblematic afforestation project because as far as my research revealed, it is the first state-sponsored continental afforestation project in the world. And so projects like Africa model themselves after FDR's Great Tree Army and the incentivization of westward movement through the rise of the profession of forestry and the claim that the treeless parts of the United States could simply be planted. And so much research with the USDA and probably very poignant to most of you in the room is the conflation of the Chinese elm with the Siberian elm. You're all very used to seeing Ulmus pumila outside and reading articles about this so-called aggressive species. That plant was introduced. It was one of the most popular, the most planted plants in the Shelter Belt Project, and every single Ulmus pumila you have here is from this project, state-sponsored, Congress-approved. And part of the issue was the reliance on the list, right? And mostly they confused Chinese elm and Siberian elm botanically. But tree claims were made and plants were planted. Ulmus pumila is considered an azonal species. meaning it is more severely influenced by the soil than by the climate. Being azonal was an immediate advantage to a plant accustomed to disturbance and sandy lands, since the American grassland was a thick store of nutrients, rich in microorganisms and abundant in organic residues and carbon. Upon its introduction to the North American grassland biome, it mobilized spread with the prevailing winds, performing, behaving, and evaluating its new sandy context. It's not its fault that it thrives here. And the vectors of its movement were embossed forever in this part of the world. And we can take some responsibility for that and celebrate almost, if we might, its prolific habit. Finally, and I have no idea how long I've been speaking. I keep looking for a timer, but I have no idea. So I'm just going to finish and then we'll see if I'm over or under. Okay. 3 North Shelter Belt System. This is the project in China. It's the final chapter, and it represents the kind of ongoing example. So again, the 3 projects trace a century of environmentalism, and across a century of environmentalism, of the rise of environmentalism and Rachel Carson and everything else we know about the world and have discovered about how climate change affects our lives, whether it's so-called desertification or mobile dust after the Dust Bowl on soil conservation mandates or air quality in China, no matter what the decade, no matter what the issue, no matter what the environmental risk, the answer is plant trees. There's no way. There's just, it can't be. So I mean, this is, I did it again. This is part of the problem, is the scale of the issue. That's really revealed in the Chinese project, not only because it's about 70 years going, but because this is the scale of the project. I had to rotate China for the sake of the slide, but that's a lot of afforestation. They have received numerous UN awards and funding for this project, numerous, uncountable, numerous. And of course, with that scale comes the scale of the nursery. This is the infrastructure that really supports the projects. And all the nurseries are, of course, located conveniently next to water sources. Not that there are always water sources at afforestation projects. This is the Sanbei nursery, one of the first ones. And it really is a design consideration. I think it's really important for landscape architects, especially because it's at these kinds of massive industrial scaled nurseries that they test typology. And if they test typology to success, it gets rolled out. And typology is in our toolbox. And once the typology works, it can just be rehearsed anywhere, anytime, regardless of the species spec. So the demands for a tally of units does little to account for the long-term health of the plant, its survival, and its dependence on irrigation or the confidence of regional villagers in such experimental injunctions. Armed with a well-defined question, the plant is inserted into the pilot to confirm typology and distribute numbers. The plant is a tool or an afterthought to the more important work of connecting irrigation tubes, grading mobile dunes, and stabilizing the shifting surface. Singular achievements accumulate, prioritizing short-term surface stabilization rather than long-term depth relations. And so these are the kind of projects that unfold. Again, it's kind of like, as a designer, I hope you can kind of see the section there, the typology, the section typology that just gets extruded forever. And ever. But when you look at these kind of photographs, this is a photograph by my friend George Steinmetz, who's fantastic. And without his ability to get to some of these very remote sites, I couldn't have had the conversations that I had. I had a lot with him and scientists at different universities in China. But of course, you have to do the forensics on these kinds of photographs and figure out what's going on. And this is what I mean by the politics of plant life. That the UN is giving this an award, and based on statistics alone and no documentation of the project is something that I think is being, that I try to express in the book as being obscured from the public. So what afforestation reveals is that planting trees, I'm redundant to what Catherine said, but I'll say it again. What afforestation reveals is that planting trees is sometimes just not enough. It's not enough to offset deforestation. It's not enough to solve carbon accumulation and rework the changing climate. It's also not enough to stabilize the current disastrous moment in environmental politics. Planting a tree can either be one of the ultimate offerings to thriving on this planet, or one of the most extreme perversions of human agency over it. We cannot just plant trees and calculate units to escape, survive, or solve crises. This is a strategy of nonsense and repetition. Rather, we could safeguard extant trees and humid biomes. We could attend to fragmentation through reforestation and insist that planting trees does not replace the slow accumulation of plant life. We could also learn to love dry lands. Thank you. Or just do stop screen, stop share. New share. Where's stop share? I don't see stop share. It's all there. I know it's. Okay, I'll just close it. No, it's okay.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for this honor. It's an honor to share this stage with Rosetta. I'm grateful to the School of Architecture and Planning for this honor, as well as to the jury of the prize committee. I want to say a big thank you to coordinating member Catherine Harris and to Rachel Jump for her hospitality. And finally say that I'm particularly honored to receive an award in honor of J.B. Jackson. I think that his work really speaks to me and his interdisciplinary look at the landscape and his thinking about cultural landscapes and looking at the world around us in the field, but really at the intersection of the environment and the page and the photograph and the canvas is quite meaningful to me and really shapes how I think about research into the past. So today I'll be speaking very briefly about my book, Historic Real Estate. And it really is meaningful to me to be here because this book was a pandemic baby. So usually, you send the books out into the world and it is silent, but that is particularly true of books that came out in the pandemic. So it's a pleasure to speak about this book in person since I have spoken about it so much on Zoom. And so this book is really it's really the first book-length history of historic preservation before the finalization of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association purchase of George Washington's home and estate in the 1850s. So if any of you have maybe taken a course in historic preservation or read a textbook account, usually that's the starting point for histories of historic preservation. And then the sort of so-called prehistory is pretty light. But what this book does is really sees the Mount Vernon movement as the culmination of a lot of debates and conversations about the social effects of capitalism in the early United States. And so I chose to focus my book on the early United States, this very national framework, not because I saw early Americans choosing to preserve sites that were necessarily directly connected to a nationally framed history or even to the American Revolution, right? There have been a lot of studies about historic sites, battlefields, homes of leaders of the Revolution. And that is the case. There are a lot of those sites that were important in the early United States. However, I see the national context of this history as particularly crucial to understanding early histories of preservation, because so many residents of the early nation debated what the fate of historic structures should be to work out a problem that they saw as particularly national. And that problem was the relationship between public good and private profit. So of course, historic preservation is much older than the United States. And many different forms of preservation have occurred globally for many years, even before my book picks up. But in the decades after the War for Independence, historic sites, I believe, made really compelling locales to test this correlation between public good and private profit. And that was because they were places where the materiality of the past and the materiality of a burgeoning market economy, or capitalist economy, I should say, where those materialities met in these historic sites. So places like churches, houses, indigenous earthworks, town squares, all of these structures weren't just simply symbols of the past or vessels of memory. They were that, but they were also real estate in a fully commoditized market economy, in a fully commoditized environment. So in the early United States, I see, and my book tells the history of advocates of preservation, how they made plans, their plans for preservation, a principal strategy for creating what they saw as a new order of property and a new order of power that were promised by revolutionary principles outlaid in founding documents of the United States. So unlike leaders in, let's say, post-revolutionary France, where, in France, many revolutionaries made historic properties the property of national government, citizens who promoted preservation of historic sites in the early United States determined that they would let properties of public interest emerge from private holdings. They defined architectural permanence achieved through preservation as a statement of what they called civic virtue, right? A civic virtue in a civil society. A willingness they saw to balance communal and personal interests. And in this way, advocates of preservation were trying to offer a way to make the burgeoning capitalist economy moral. Now, it's important to note, I think, that I am not saying advocates of preservation, so-called, were moral. And I'm not saying they were not moral, right? But what I'm interested in is how individuals in these early decades of the early US constructed this ideal of what preservation was and what it meant to society. So in the early 19th century, many Americans were deeply concerned about how a changing economy, as I said, was affecting society. And a variety of men and women addressed their growing concerns by turning to sites that encapsulated their anxiety, right? And in the book, I trace these debates over 3 types of properties. And I'll just give a very brief overview of those today. Happy to answer more in questions. And then offer a few thoughts about what I think this new history of preservation may suggest for us about historic preservation today. So the first type of properties that I study are what I call corporate properties. Beginning in the early 1780s, early Americans who were advocating for preservation really homed in on efforts to preserve what they called public historic structures. These were owned by corporate entities, and you see a sampling here. They were things like town squares, held by a land company, municipal cemeteries, landmark houses of worship, and governmental buildings. These sites attracted the attention of city residents in the first decades of the early US because their fates were bound up in debates about the relationship between state authority and local determination, local self-determination in communities across the United States. So when residents of aspirational and established urban centers debated the material and legal perpetuity of sites like these, they engaged in larger efforts to define and enforce principles of corporate governance in the new nation. And here we're looking at sort of at the top left of the screen, it's now called Mound Cemetery in Marietta, Ohio. To the right, we have the old Pennsylvania State House, also known as Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And on the bottom left, we have a Torah Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. So the first chapter and sort of the beginning of the book, I look at the 1780s, right? And historic preservation, I see these conversations emerge not in the oldest of cities that we might expect in colonial centers, but in the Ohio country, on the west side of the Ohio River. Here we see a plan of the city of Marietta, Ohio, drafted in the 1780s by Rufus Putnam, a colonizer from Massachusetts who was working as an agent of the Ohio Company, going to claim lands claimed by, inhabited by the Shawnee and the Miami peoples. So in moving to the west side of the Ohio River, they encountered what you see represented here in these geometric shapes in their urban plan. Indigenous earthworks built by Algonquian-speaking people thousands of centuries before. And rather than ignoring them or demolishing them all, they chose to keep some standing and incorporate them into the city plan. And this was, in their minds, evidence of ancient America and ancient architecture that could be incorporated into their new city. So we see through the building of Marietta in the 1780s, well into the 19th century, a claim that Ohio Company colonizers are performing a public good by preserving ancient architecture, as they said, so great a monument of antiquity in their new city. You can imagine that in performing this so-called public good, they're also performing a service for themselves, right? They're colonizing, they're claiming this land as their own, and they're selling plots of land and boosting themselves in a huge landscape full of new cities. They're the ones making claims to preserving ancient architecture. We see similar histories in more familiar sites, perhaps. Here we have a rendering of, as I mentioned, the old State House in Philadelphia. In the same decades that there are debates about preservation of indigenous earthworks by colonizers in the Ohio Valley, we also have city leaders in Philadelphia debating whether or not the city of Philadelphia should demolish or keep standing what becomes Independence Hall at this point. So in 1812, when the state capital of Pennsylvania moves to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth decides it's going to sell the old State House, and they instruct the sale to happen according to sell this to the highest bidder, right? Tear down the old State House and develop this part of the city. And in this moment, and by linking these conversations to very similar ones happening around municipal authority and corporate authority in Marietta, in a very different place in many ways, I point us to what I call the politics of demolition, right? Which is the flip side of this conversation around the public charge of corporate leaders, right? Leaders of land companies, of cities, of congregations, to achieve architectural permanence in the claim of the public good, right? So people who are writing about the leaders who want to demolish this building are saying there's no way these men, and they all are white men, have the public good at heart, right? Who would tear down Independence Hall, right? This place was valued as a historic site in the 1810s, much as it is today. And so I see the politics of demolition then being a key part of this coin of thinking about anxieties about who runs corporations, right? Who runs corporate entities? What are they doing to the built environment? Are they operating out of a desire for personal gain or public good? And so in sort of telling the histories of these, then I open up these conversations about the preservation of so-called public buildings in Boston and Charleston and Newport as a way of showing that preservation in this era was very much centered on sort of anxieties about how corporate governance could affect the public good, right? If men can't be, charged to make good decisions in the public interest in a land company or in municipal politics, how can they be charged to lead a nation? So by the 1820s, I saw a change in debates over preservation. And I saw that swings in an increasingly speculative market brought about a new type of historic property, brought new scrutiny, I should say, to a new type of historic property. And that was one of commercial activity. Or localities such as you see here characterized by their position in marketplaces of goods and of real estate. So maybe you remember from a history class at some point, there are two big financial panics in this era in 1819 and 1837. And early Americans started to say, interesting, in this new economy, there seems to be a boom and a bust every 20 years, right? And that started to be real cause for concern. And business proprietors, political partisans, they started to define preservation as a means to create opportunities for commercial profit, and also a way of limiting commercial profit. So merchants, tavern proprietors, and image makers, right? The men who made these very images perpetuated historic architecture as a competitive market strategy, right? In some ways similar to those debates over public buildings, but as you can see here, it looks very different, right? The centers of commerce are really merged with these historic buildings. And so in doing this, they start enticing customers with historically conscious visions of respectable consumption, right? So these are no longer corporate leaders. These are men who are, on the right hand, we see an upholsterer who's working out of a 17th century building in Boston. I was able to trace the history of this image and find letters from John K. Simpson, the proprietor. He created this business card first, and he sent it to Caleb Snow, who was writing a history of Boston, and said, you should include this image of my building in your history of Boston, right? Which was basically a guidebook to the city of Boston in the 1830s, 1820s. And so lo and behold, this building starts appearing in guidebooks of Boston after Simpson sends this in. So you can actually see a direct effort of a business proprietor to get his building into historic guidebooks, right? So now you have people who are coming to Boston, right? This is the rise of railroads and travel and tourism. And now they see John K. Simpson's shop as a local historic site. And now they're going to put that on the itinerary. And of course, you're going to get consumers, right? In that way. We see this in series of publications as well. And I trace the work of image makers who are very much drawing in customers for their ability to portray facades like you see here in New York. I just want to show this image. I won't go into the details of it, but it was one of my favorite images to think through. And this was the birthplace of liberty, as you declare here, as it declares here. William Brown is selling clothes. He's selling ready-made clothes in a not very fashionable district in Philadelphia. So he starts to tell people, just come visit the birthplace of liberty, where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? It may not be the shiny new stores on Market Street, or on Chestnut Street, I should say, but come over to Market Street and you can see a historic building and come see the ready-made clothes. Maybe even though they're not as fancy, you can perform a very respectable consumption because I'm keeping this building in place and opening it to consumers. And I just want to make a point here that this is the so-called birthplace of liberty today in Philadelphia. It was entirely reconstructed in the 1970s before the US bicentennial. And I think these histories of commercial preservation, as you might call it, are the most erased from our histories of preservation, because it's very tempting for us to say that's not preservation. That's not motivated by true preservation. When in fact, I think these are very important parts of layered histories of places that can help bring new voices into conversation about who profits from engaging with historic built environments and why. So as debates around commercial incursions into historic spaces come about, there starts to become more, there's more debate about the place of history and sort of commerce. And what comes, this is Carpenter's Hall, restorations start to happen. There's more fear that what's driving historic preservation is in fact commercial greed. Houses in particular start to come under fire, right? So here's the house of William Penn, formerly inhabited by the founder of Philadelphia, now inhabited by a shop. And so as houses by the 1830s and 40s begin to be seen as sacred, right? There becomes a sort of attempt to separate domestic space from commercial space. Commerce and historic sites and preservation come under fire. So the third type of historic site I talk about is historic houses, right? And the intense attention that early Americans start to pay to the interiors of houses, asking them to look as they looked when great men lived there. So in the 1830s, for instance, there's a great debate about how to preserve Monticello, in the interior of Monticello, the house of Thomas Jefferson. You see the rise of historic buildings, historic museums around those domestic interiors. But you also see attention to exteriors, and not just buildings, but family estates. And so I also look at these family estates that the proprietors engage in what I call evolutionary preservation. And here, one of the sites I studied is the Warren House. It was quote unquote preserved in 1846 when John C. Warren tore down his family house of the colonial era and built this house in its place. He said it was preservation because it was on the site. And you can see here in these sort of plaques in between the first and the second story, they tell the history of the house and merge the history of the old house with this new one, which of course is built in sort of a new style that was considered to be more permanent. I argue then in this third section with the rise of the Historic House Museum and also the rise of suburbanization, that what is happening here is concerns over what happens to the family and to labor in the household in this moment of economic transition. Here, this is the cover image, of course, that I say that one of the arguments of domestic preservation and evolutionary preservation at this point in particular is that suburban development and suburban landscapes can be made civil in an era of urbanization. And I can't talk about it, but I want to put out Ashland, the home of Henry Clay, as another example of a house that was preserved through demolition when James B. Clay tore down his father's house and built this in the same foundation trenches. So to wrap up, as I said, my book concludes with the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and really presents this as a culmination of these debates about economic transition. And really sees this as a history that is important in and of its own, but also a history that has maybe something to offer to how we think about histories of preservation today. So quickly, I'll throw out some ideas, and maybe this will be good for conversation as well. First, I think it's really important to recognize how these debates about the fate of historic structures were central to the founding of the United States. I think it's very important to acknowledge this because there's a real proclivity to say, oh, well, the US is always, it was a new nation, it was forward thinking, right? Nobody cared about the past in the early nation. But I think that these are, these cases are important to understand because they were not somehow outside of the mainstream of the early United States. They weren't trying to stop economic development, and they weren't operating out of nostalgia. They were attempts to engage in shaping economy and society. At the same time, I think it's really important to see the motives and consequences of early advocates of preservation for what they were. Many times we refer to people who preserved these sites as saviors of buildings or people who are ahead of their time. But in fact, they were very much people of their time. And they often used preservation of historic structures to serve as a means of exclusion, erasure, removal, and of course, public profit in the appealing to the public good. It's important for us to confront preservation as a tool of colonization that is often sort of caked in the language of civilization or permanence. And I'm pointing here again to Mound Cemetery in Marietta as a primary example of this. And I think we can see this in later decades in what becomes Florida, what becomes California, right? And what becomes Arizona and New Mexico. Confronting the complex histories of these sites, I think, are really important because they can bring to light those exclusions. right? And those demolitions. But it can also bring to light, I think, really important factors of what I think are often called, at least in my field, layered histories of sites, right? That's not all about sort of the original condition contrasted with today, right? But we can bring in new voices of shopkeepers, right? Of people who are laborers and gave access or cared for particular sites. So confronting these complex histories, I think ultimately is a strategy we can use to get more people interested in historic places and make arguments about what constitutes historical integrity of a building and who really gets to be a preservationist. And finally, I'll wrap up by saying, that I think that this new history of preservation shows that how we define preservation is a way of defining what sort of economic and social values we subscribe to as historical actors. When we think about the public good of preservation, it's important that we don't simply think about the integrity of a building, right? It's important that we think about who we hire and how much we pay, who we invite to the table, and why exactly we think a particular site, whether it be a garden or a park or a structure, why that should stand the test of time and how. To my mind, there are many fields that really speak to these, including sustainability, maintenance studies, environmental justice, and the feminist ethics of care. These are all really great fields that I think we can draw on to do this. And I think when we see history for what it tells us about our fundamental definitions of preservation, we can in turn see how our approaches to preservation are ultimately a statement of how we value people, not just buildings. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
You could all condense yourselves a little bit. I don't know. I guess.
Should I just shut this down?
Oh, yeah.
So I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, and I'm excited we have this opportunity to talk with, with the conversation with others have been saying. And I do feel like knowledge that constructed through conversations more so than some other groups handing down things from online or something like that. So I believe in the construction of knowledge through conversation. And for some of you who are in my class, you will recognize that I have brought some quotes.
I learned about this today. I'm very intrigued.
Anyway, but we're first going to start out maybe with just a kind of general question, which is around this construction of value, which I think both of you engage with, and also the artifact. I think for a crossover I see between these two books, I see many, is this interest in the artifact, and in a sense, resistance to its rigidity. So rather than one of the things I really appreciate about the concept of demolition and preservation, the idea that it's still in this process of being preserved, although it's physicality and change not the same, but a Brick as a concept, and obviously the idea of artifact as a restriction of the liveness of plants, which I think kind of relates to this idea of so I just want to throw that out and see if you wanted to chew on that concept a little bit. The shifting sands of artifacts.
I mean,
artifacts were a primary category that I looked at when I first began this study, and that was in part because as I began the study, people told me, oh, well, there is no preservation. There really isn't, you can't write a history of preservation in this early era. And so I started looking at objects, at artifacts, as something that was opposed to preservation, right? Well, there is not preservation, and so I must study artifacts. But of course, once I got to a certain point, I thought, well, the artifact is the preservation for many people, and it's not opposed, but it's one many media that I think, the building itself is an artifact. I think that, it's not simply that the building is not an artifact. So, I think that category can be helpful in challenging this idea that not opposed to preservation.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up research. I think there's a lot of overlap in how we approach, and not just some of the terms, but our approach more broadly. And, for me, landscape is a process, it's not a product of the environment, and I think building architecture is often made into an artifact and really is a building process. And so, that's why maintenance and care and tending and fixing and repair and everything that goes along with that becomes actually really important to something like preservation. In terms of but I came to artifact much the same way, not through that rhetoric per se, but through teaching, because I teach plants, I teach ecology, I teach plant design. My students to see the world, and not the built environment. And I have to break the object thinking in the first few weeks. And so I came to this sort of revelation that I teach how plants grow, not how they look. And that was like, then the students were like, oh, okay, that works, right? And so as soon as you teach how something grows, then it's an organism, then it's alive, it's breathing, you're breathing, sort of connectivity. And so many people that love plants are obsessed with herbarium samples and flora and representations of plants, and because they are beautiful, they really are beautiful, right? But it's really like for landscape architects, you need to work with a living organism. You can't work with a desiccated organism, and you can't. I mean, botanists can, we just can't. So it becomes this fetishized object that I saw circulating a great deal in our field as a kind of like emblem of I love plants. Like, here's this dried up sample that I scanned or that I went to the herbaria for. Like, look, how does that help with science? Like, is that just okay? That's interesting. Put it over here. Now let's talk about going to see a plant. It's actually. And so I just started to differentiate by using the term. That's an artifact that's interesting. Let's go look at the living organism to learn how it grows. You're not going to learn that.
That concept of morphology seems like it also ties in, and I think maybe both of you could talk about that. So the question of form, but form is a process, not form as an object. Formation. Formation, yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's great. It's great. And I also wanted to tie in a phrase from your work, environmental materiality, which I think somehow sort of holds like the second ideas into a sort of a conversational space. But I did want to respond. You said it was a question you could talk about. But the question of southern colonialism. Things that how it relates, and clearly it relates in both cases. It's a erasure of the whiteness of certain projects. I just wanted to tell you guys if you wanted to throw that into.
Well, I'll respond to seeing your, and I read some, but now I know more. And I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
But or maybe I just admitted that I haven't read it. But either way. I'm intrigued because I think what we both do is we look at the years leading up to some of the more successful attempts to colonize. So it's the failures of colonization that actually like ramp up to some of the ones we live with and endure and seem so lasting. But those failed attempts, like there was a good, 70 years of failed planting projects that just weren't taken, right? And it needed crisis, and it needed expertise, and it needed scale. There were these needs that were constructed around terms like soil conservation is also this term allowed all of those things to come together so that it became this sort of mandate, started a whole field. And in the same way, I think preservation, there are all these like attempts at preservation, which what I've read into your presentation is that there are these attempts at preservation that people are making. But the government is like, or whatever, that maybe the state or the individual retailer, or whomever it is saying, well, that's not quite it. Like, that's not working yet. Here, we're gonna do it differently. We're gonna like the slate clean, we're gonna go in the house floor, make a business card, we're gonna hand it out. We're gonna try all of these things until it clicks. And then preservation clicks. I think that's interesting if you reveal a history that is pre-click. So you. That's our.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah. But I think,
I know myself.
as what, preservation in many ways like is successful in the 1780s and is a direct means of colonization. And I think from a historian's perspective, there's been a lot of attention to narratives or using landscapes to tell narratives of colonization. Where part of what I'm saying is that preservation is physically the act of colonizing land, right? It's not just something that helps create a narrative, which is important, an important part of conservation, but it is a claiming of land. I think it's also important to recognize that, what do Americans celebrate as a historic site and B, preservation, right? So historic sites, there's no attention to Native communities in North America who are trying to maintain tangible or intangible heritage as preservation, right? So there's nobody talking about, Narragansett stone wall building, and communities that are maintaining places. That's not considered, preservation in the early West. So it's about who gets the ability to say this is some kind of public act, an act of public interest in shaping the landscape, right? For the most part, Native people, unless they are giving access to a site that is valued by settler society, that's not considered preservation. I write about, sort of several instances in which you can see it as a direct path of erasure of indigenous structures. But I think, as I mentioned, also embedded in this idea about civil society, right? Civilizing a new nation and environment. That in and of itself is a colonial project. I think this notion of embedding the idea of permanence as civil and impermanent structures as primitive, so-called, right? Or associated with particular races or nations or people. So I think it's happening in a lot of layers. It's still over.
It's not over. It's
Right.
not past. And I think that's part of what we sort of learned from the continuance of the tree planting project, is that it seems like a very direct link to settler colonialist, ongoing projects. No longer, not imagined in the past, not imagined as something that we're somehow done with or resolved of even. But still continuing and ongoing and replacing with ecologies
And the social outcomes of that. I mean, there's a great deal of displacement. Needs in the book.
Yeah.
Displacement in projects in China, projects is the ones in the United States. I mean, it was the tool of settlements and my place, timber contract. I mean, it was successful operation. Much more so than architecture, but it was people first and foremost. And I think that is, I mean, what sometimes we live with consequences, like the species around us that might not be from here, like us. So, there's a sort of settler mentality that's embedded in so many layers. And I get questions. I also want to ask both of you. Am I allowed to ask the question?
Of course.
I mean, I ask often, I know it's contentious, so maybe it's nice if it's a small group. What do I think of decolonization? This is a question, because I never use the term decolonization in this book, or ever. I don't think we can do anything. And I'm concerned that if we think we can, just by reviewing the history or showing up, differently, light acknowledgements and whatever that list is, there's no undoing. You can't uncolonize. I mean, you just said preservation is colonization. I mean, it is the foundations of it. So I'm just curious how you would answer that question. Because decolonization studies is a real thing, ongoing and important. But it is, I think it's charged. I think it's pretty charged.
Yeah, so I guess I've got some objectives, so let's see. I mean, I think I'm going to talk about the evolution of my faith in my syllabus, actually, for my faith class. And there was a point when I was teaching theory, and I was thinking about it from the perspective of theory that I had learned. So I went to a literary criticism program and graduated in 1988, which means that I learned a lot about French people.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of male French people. Other people from Czech that. So I was thinking about sort of framing that as a way to start to engage with kind of landscape architecture as potentially thinking about post-humanism, it's thinking about all kinds of sort of constructs that were existing in the world around me that had been largely created in that context, in that mid-80s, late 70s, sort of like that. And I still think that those voices are interesting sometimes. I mean, I think right now time is definitely worth talking about, and it's worth talking about from the point of view of the Bentham, the object, and it's worth sort of saying this is what's all around you. I don't know if you guys noticed, but there's massive animals in this building. So you are not free of that. However, at one point I started deciding to put images of all the people who were writing the texts that my students were reading in my syllabus. So I made, the file of all the images of the people who are writing the text, and I looked at it and thought, oh, you're that is definitely not good. So I ended up spending some time in the library and looking at, articles and thinking about things. And at that point, the week or two that I talked about themes of colonization was called decolonization. And I thought about that for a fair amount. And then I spent time with Ted Popola, who runs the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. And I fact brought me to a class, he talked to my students, and he used the word indigenizing for his process. And place knowing, not place making, and speaking about things from that perspective. And thus I arrived at thinking, oh, right, I'm not actually trying to subtract anything, because I don't think subtraction, I love how it's in his book, and I think it's really important, observation about how buildings, survive and don't survive, and cities survive and do the dishabitate thing as well. But I do feel that the most important piece for me right now is bringing in Robin Walkenmer's voice into my discussions, is bringing in the traditional ecological knowledge that is all around us and has been for so long missold as erased. These are not erasures, they're actually living people who are existing in this world and have pieces of knowledge to actually reframe this question that I have come to spend my life on, which is landscapes. And so that's my answer. I recognize myself as a person who's evolved through the several periods. And I think right now I find this to be the most authentic way I can understand the place that I'm in and the significant histories that are present, not past, and overlapping concepts within this space.
But it's also about, that was beautiful, thank you for that. it's also, it's not just about like finding traditional ecological knowledge nuggets, it's about remembering our own. I think that is something that's the true spirit of colonization, is that it wasn't just indigenous taking, it was the making of settler colonial
Well,
work
there's
that
a,
takes
yeah.
away all connectivity with the living organism of our planet, right? So all of this is the land, talk about landless.
Yeah.
Aldo Leopold has a beautiful quote that I use at the beginning of the book. I won't get it wrong. I will get it right by reading it. The problem then, it's nice and cracky here.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
The problem then is how to bring about a striving for harmony with a land among people, many of whom have forgotten there is any such thing as land, among whom education and culture have become almost synonymous with landless. And so this, I like to pair, now that I found it, with a quote from Vine Deloria Jr., who basically says it, you know, the success of settler colonialism wasn't in the taking of Indian land, he uses Indian, he used it, it was in the making of Indian landlessness. And in making Indian landlessness, all future generations were also landless, which is why we're landless. And so we're part of a continuum. And I think seeing ourselves as a continuum rather than a kind of like, this happened, that happened, we're over here, they're over there, they're over there, they're down south, they're in up north, like this sort of day to day. This is a much larger intergenerational trauma that we inherit and have to work against to be landful again, right? To just be just overwhelmingly landful, like, so that this can't happen, you know, or that, you know, we can name as many plants as we can, you know, I mean, if you ask a teenager to name the names of the cars in the parking lot, they'll just go one by one, you know everything, right? Ask them to name the trees. What? That's the culture we live in. They can name the trees, they can name the cars, they can name the sneakers maybe. But this is landlessness. This is the creation of landlessness.
And it's that, I mean, in a sense, the colonial project also takes all the people who came from somewhere and moved to somewhere and makes them landless as well.
That's what I,
Yeah.
correct.
So that sense of being, you know, where is the place? I really enjoyed lesson your description of the idea that you belong to a boreal forest, like you are a being of a particular eco zone, and therefore that in and of itself defines you. And or that it provides you with a migratory habitat, you know, space that you can move within, but not necessarily beyond, right?
I feel good where I know my plants. That's it. And I'm at the edge of like, wow, this is different.
Well, if you think
That's
about like
cool, but it's different.
the mycorrhizal, right, the whole concept of being like a part of the web, right? The trees at the center of the forest, and at ASLA, I mean, this is the trees at the center of the forest, they have these robust networks, so by the time you get to the edge, well, part of their robust network is gone, and it's the edge, they're the edge, and so they don't have as robust network of life, you know, and ways to share resources and all those things. And so I think, you know, sometimes I think that is a really powerful metaphor for me about being landless is I don't have a robust network. I don't have the knowledge under my feet of the generations of, you know, having used these plants for the livable space.
I mean, you're not alone.
No,
That's the thing. No, I mean, and that's what is, we could also flip the coin and say, well, that's beautiful because we've noticed that. Because now we know, we can tell. So before we couldn't even tell what was sort of wrong, what was like missing, or okay. So if reconnecting with the living world and the living environment is part of healing, even healing our preservation mind, or what we save, what we choose to save, what we choose not to save, then let's get started. You know?
And I think one thing to add to that is sort of, model or thinking of indigenizing, but I think that there is still a place for decolonizing methods, because at least coming from the history side of things, right? The first step They're indigenous figures that give me, sort of historians who talk about first steps like decolonization, that's so important is to understand the history of colonization, right? Like that's the first step. And I think that if we lose understanding and study of the process of colonization, we don't understand why are our landscapes like this, why, society, politics, economy, so that to me, indigenizing and decolonizing, they can work together. They don't think we can just sort of lose sight of history about colonization. That's so really important, and that a lot of.
As long as they're read alongside indigenous systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, actually,
Don't get the spotlight.
I'm gonna bring another book in. that
Okay.
You've read, or maybe you all have read it, I don't know, but Roxanne Dunrow.
Yes.
This recent book,
Yeah,
it just really tries to pull together all of
does
these
it very
pieces.
well.
And it even talks about the Irish, as a sort of both a force of settler colonialism and these colonized people in themselves. And I mean, I think, yes, sorry, just to.
Her book is just called the Indigenous History of the.
Oh, no, wait, she has a more recent one.
Which
She's
one?
called Not a Nation of Immigrants.
Oh, yes, that one.
Yeah, which I think
Yeah.
somehow, maybe it's not the reason, I think it is.
Well, both or either.
Yeah, either, you could read them both, I guess. Anyway, yeah. So the other thing I want to do.
And wait, the reason for that is, just before you need to start getting. A lot, many, land is not property. It is not, in many cultures, not just Native American or, Iroquois language or, Mapuche in Chile, wherever you look on the globe, we know that the lands that are being preserved or conserved, often gets very conflated, are in the hands of indigenous people. We know that. And it's some 67% or something of conserved lands are in the hands of indigenous people, because it's like, we're really failing that last, chunk. And burning it greatly. And so why are those lands thriving? Because land is an ancestor, because it's a teacher, because it's equated, and the human is at the top of Aristotle's ladder. Aristotle's ladder, but humans at the top, and plants are one step above mollusks. So the ladder that ranks life puts plants really low in this great Euro-Western philosophy that really underpins a lot of how we learn, especially in institutional building, and we're all, employed by company universities, and, however we want to define that. And at the end of the day, we're plant dependent species. So if we can't recognize that healthy land is healthy plant is healthy human, then we can study all the colonial histories we want. We still won't have that connection. And so the reason to read the counter narrative is to reconnect.
I think I particularly enjoy the way that you connect that relational piece with sentience, and the sort of challenge to like, the latter, the challenge to the way that I think you really want to talk about why is it different to plant something that's in a plastic box versus a seed, and the root bound plant versus the seed able to put out things roots, and I mean I think thinking about that question of potentially even challenging what is sentience, or sort of what is, the ability of being to be respected or to be thought of as constituent of public sort of, I feel like that's, something seeds behave. And it's right. They move, they do.
I mean, yeah.
And that question of sort of ecology beyond economy, it's about not the value, which I do think, is something, I love the image of the beginning of the mound being sort of taken over as a value, like as creating history, and like, oh no, we've really done, we're just like Rome.
All right.
We've been here for a long time. Because we've adopted this. We just recently erased, like we just recently moved them off this space. And they're still out there, they're somewhere, but we've said, no, this is our space, and we've like, we put your mountains, and we hold on.
We have a circle on a map around.
Right,
So geometry first. Yeah.
This guy,
And that's where the mountain is. It's fascinating.
yeah, I think it's a fascinating thing too, because it really brought to mind the ways in which that cartographic moved to erase the interior, like often, like, oh, we just look at the edges of this constantly, we're not looking inside, and then when we got to the inside, we said, oh, this is just.
Well, to the point of value, I mean, I think that the most sort of straightforward, or obvious is to think about, valuing land, right, commoditizing and the project of preservation does. But I mean, something I'm interested in this book is the way that that is used to create value for certain types of labor and not others, right? Certain types of images and not others, certain types of goods or consumer experiences, and not others. So I think that that is when I think about, understanding the histories of objects or even artifacts, right? Sort of the material histories or environmental materialism. To me, that's not just understanding houses or parts as material goods, but it's saying that we have to understand the history of photography to understand what a history, to understand what a photograph of a building means at a certain point, right? You have to understand generic forms of fiction to understand what buildings mean or what active preservation means in the 1850s when people are writing about buildings, right? So that it's not just understanding environment as a material object, but to me, environmental materiality is really having to understand histories of materialities that may seem not directly related to the environment.
Processes that the history are supporting those artifacts.
Sure, right, like that, how we can look at a photograph of a building before it's demolished and say, well, that's not really preservation. So how did people at the time understand what it meant to take a photograph? So what the materiality of that was, the act that that performed. You can't understand what it meant for buildings or the process of creating meanings of landscapes if we don't understand photograph on its own, right? Or a poem on its own.
The cards, even the card, the reflection of the card, it really brought back to sort of early histories of photography in France, and when people trying to invent a way to please.
Right.
And some of the early experiments that you say with dioramas and things like that, as opposed to really photographs it before the photograph was really.
Right.
I wanted to, before we, see, are there any questions? You guys want to throw in a thought, a question, an idea?
I mean, to break the silence while you're thinking, if you fast forward, the only way that China can provide proof, of the tree planting efforts is to send photographs to the and the world bank. So it's photographic evidence is still a really charged politics, because as soon as you decide what you keep in and what you put out, you're making decisions.
One of the contemporary one of the photograph is, triply unreliable narrative. Really, yeah. I mean, since the pyramids were moved on the 2010 magazine, we've all, sort of lived with the world and it's photograph, and especially AI. You could be photographing some trees, but they might not be.
No, that's why also something we have. I mean, I'm not sure how much. I mean, just both the archive and the fieldwork have to be part of the research project, because the map is alive. It's geometry. It's always alive. The maps, and then you go around with it. And it's like, oh, this is doing propaganda. I get it. Or the photograph can be alive. You get there and you actually sort of see it. And there were just some areas that the UN was, especially through the UNCCD and COP. Still getting started on the conference parties, but they were touting these different towns having these major tree planting initiatives. I kept scrolling, on Google Earth, these yeah, you know, that's sometimes what you have to do late at night to find these coordinates and look for things. And I was working with my friend George Steinmetz, who does a ton of photography for like National Geographic or whatever. So whenever he's somewhere, I'm like, can you just go a few miles this way and tell me if there's this or that? And most of the projects in Africa, like, they're not there. Even the pilots, they're just not there. It's really an incredible fiction, you know, to your point, sort of photographing the narrative fiction to continue to garner money into relatively corrupt governments that do not plant trees. The African project. Wow. Because, yeah, so it's largely a committee, the Pan-African Agency for the Great Wall, that's trying to like unite the sub-Saharan. But, yeah, and it's hard to publish. A lot of the stories I can't publish, you know, or I can't publish this, but, you know, and like in China, a lot of people put the trees in, that they get trees dumped from the air, from planes, big bundles of trees. And so you have to plant these, we're gonna fly back over and whatever in a month, and we want to see if they're planted. That's the only way. It's a huge area. And so, boom, you know, and if you're a farmer in a dryland area where you know how little water you have, and they're gonna dump like 100,000 poplars at you, you know that they're gonna just suck up your water because they're poplars. So they plant them upside down. So they can fly over and count them. And they won't take their water. But you know, I can't publish that. That's colloquial reality, you know. But that's how messed up these projects are.
Yeah. Which has to do with, I mean, in a sense, I mean, weaving it back into the colonial question, it's a not ground truthing the potential at all, but imagining it's a point of
Just so you can go to DC and they have like a booth, like they literally have like a booth at top for what they're doing. Everyone can. And there's medals, there's, you know, there's excitement, there's photographs, there's handshaking, there's hands with plants. There's, you know, and everybody's excited, and it trickles down to the same thing, when you go to IKEA and grab the little thing, it's an offset your purchase, you know? Come on, IKEA takes down Siberian old growth all the time. You can't just plant a tree somewhere because you like, you know, what do they say, round up to plant a tree? It's like, I don't know. I don't know.
So we're throwing into question carbon offsets.
Absolutely,
point, yeah.
absolutely. When it's street lighting,
Right,
not your own tree.
right, grow your own tree, I guess, when you're really want to. Yeah.
Do either of your books go into sort of the intricacies of the decision-making processes that led to deciding where the trees would go, what kind of tree would go, or what buildings would be preserved?
Yeah, mine definitely does. It's all about the debates over who should have the power to preserve and in what form. So a lot of my book is about debates about form, right? Is a photograph preservation, right? Is, you know, tearing down your Henry Clay's house and rebuilding it, is that preservation or not? And who should buy into different models and why, right? What do they think is society? So to me, the debate, I understand sort of the consequences or what people feel is safe without the debate and how that evolves.
Yeah, the debates are purposefully obscured in deforestation. So I do a lot of forensic digging, and they're theorists in the American case. You could definitely read about that, and I would say if you're really interested, some of the footnotes, just like the PDF of the Prairie States Forestry Project is online. It's open source, so if you want to read that, you're going to come on and answers to that project, which is this, again, this idea that we know exactly where to plant and what to plant, but you just want to be able to read through that because they don't know exactly what to plant where, but it seems so official, right? And in the Chinese case, it's 70 years. I mean, there are so many generations to the project. It's been named and renamed different times. It's been, you know, when in the first like 2 decades, it was really seen as a failure. And so it needed this whole rebrand and, you know, Yeah, I had to work with a lot of students in China to read, in Chinese, which I couldn't do. And I also couldn't go to a lot of the projects in China, because as soon as like I would show up, it's like the story would change. So, I noticed that, so sort of trying, it's also, yeah, so who and how you work with, different places, so. I hope that I make it more clear, but it's just not clear. It's not a documented, I think this is the first history of deforestation. I think, putting together in one place, that isn't conflated with reforestation. And I hope people build on it, because there's a lot to figure out, so we can call it out.
Other questions? Chris and Ian?
I have
Yeah,
a question.
Great.
Couple down.
that's what it is. Where we all of them.
Yeah. It's actually not a quick question, but
Good.
I have a sort of thing that I would love for you guys to speak on this kind of in between your books and what you're sort of focusing on in terms of like preserving land. And so to me, like preservation is like a form of maintenance, and that sort of assumes this continued acting on something. And so let's say, for example, like the Everglades, and we're sort of like rewilding out it. Like at what point does it become complicated and convoluted to sort of maintain or rewild, quote unquote, a place like that? Like how do you guys sort of look at that kind of crisis, that situation?
Well, I can start maybe a bit obliquely, so thinking about environmental history, so I teach environmental history and how we look at sustainability, and one of the things environmental historians often say about these projects of restoration, but it's important to recognize that there was no sort of like pristine locked-in past that somehow just changed. So, this is not addressing to that, but thinking about, there are sort of epochs of vast change, but there was sort of no step. Like getting people to understand sort of environment, like the doors of change, so it's never something from something in historian work. But you probably have more specific.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of environment is even I mean, that's that, because I'm also a historian, and yeah, we can trace when the word environment started to get used. So this is also a problem when people just sort of use it as this clunky label. So we just threw around preservation, restoration, and conservation, like within a minute here. And then three really different concentrated, really different socioeconomic and political histories, but land differently. And so, if you want to talk about the Everglades, I'm thrilled. We're doing a lot of work in Florida, and I know well over the head of restoration. We have a Everglades young for 100 years, and I'm in my class actually. This is the time I'm teaching, and I was just waiting for this moment, for my last year work. So just students to ask them questions. This is showing all of these slides, all the things, about the big project of, saving the Everglades. And then uses the word restoration all the time, not conservation. Soil conservation, it was soil conservation before it was conservation. And that started in the 30s, I go through that history. It was never conservation without soil, so that's it. But soil conservation was invented to deal with the Dust Bowl. But different. Just to start, sorry, now we'll go back to the Everglades. Then at the end of the class, of course, last year, it's like, so tell us a little bit more about restoring Everglades. Does that mean that you're restoring the sheep flow, or you're restoring, sawgrass, or you're restoring? And it's such a sweet question. And he said, no. Wait, I thought you guys were landscape architects. You get it wrong. Like, we're restoring our canals. Okay, so the great project of restoration in Everglades is the great project of restoring the infrastructure that the Army Corps installed to control the Everglades. So restoration of what, and the myth that goes along with that has to be asked, and not just restoration, because everybody just goes to click environment. No, what is environment? Or no, how do you restore the environment? There's no such, that's another fiction. So they in the Everglades, when you make a foot, they put the Okeechobee in a bowl, concrete bowl, and they tipped it the other way. into their canals. There's no, you can't undo that without destroying all of the sheep flow will all go to the west. It's gonna flood Miami from the backside. It's gonna take down all of that economy. I mean, you can't, once you tip the Everglades to go the other way into the Gulf, that's it. So it's tricky. So the question of restore to what? The other trick the Army Corps has is that they were the first to do the aerial photography of the coast of the United States, all of the United States, after the capture picture of that. And in a court of law, you have to restore to the first evidence. The first evidence is usually a photograph. So they have this really great business model where they're constantly being funded to restore their own projects. Because they have proof that that was the first reality. Yeah. There are some great books on the history of the Army Corps of Engineers. That if you're interested in the word restoration, they really need. Yeah, continues to be the power of the image, for sure. Which is why I think we both love archives too. It's like, I mean, the USDA archives, I feel, I can't, I just wanna sit there all day long, yeah. And the stories behind it, really remarkable.
I'd like to say thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.